it's not really an article. I guess it's a report that's released every year by the NLIHC. It's a low income housing organization that kind of follows the affordability of housing for the average American. And as a result of inflation, not only in the sector regarding retail, but also in the rent portion of the index, they are essentially highlighting the fact that it's becoming increasingly more difficult for people to be able to afford rent on the average salary. And I thought I'd share some statistics, which is kind of interesting. So first off, they estimate that to be able to comfortably afford a modest 2-bedroom rental home in the US, it's roughly, you'd have to make about $32 an hour full time. So, and for a 1-bedroom rental home, it would be roughly $26.74 per hour. And the most striking statistic I saw was, of the nation's 20 most common occupations, 14 of these occupations pay median wages lower than the 1-bedroom housing wage. These 14 occupations account for roughly 64 million workers. So that's about 42% of the workforce, which would be considered struggling, or not necessarily struggling, but not being able to comfortably afford the average 1-bedroom or 1-bedroom rental home, whether that's an apartment or otherwise, in the United States. And they kind of highlight a little bit about the problems that we're facing on the homelessness side, that it's, I think there's roughly 653,000 people who are experiencing homelessness on any given night, which is a 12% rise from the previous year. So again, it kind of showcases the issues that we're facing from the affordable housing standpoint. And I know this is a issue that's we're facing all across the country, and I'm sure they're facing it in other countries as well, but maybe there's a little bit more of a support system in other countries to account for these scenarios. But I thought I'd share this because obviously this is going to be impacting multifamily developers, people who are seeking opportunities in the affordable housing space, which is an area that a lot of people are, it's a very in need product. And so if you are someone who's looking to do affordable housing development, I mean, you'll not only be doing a service to the community, but there's also a lot of incentives out there for you to be able to make the numbers work. Because in order for you to have these developments work, you're going to have to get different incentives, and there's a lot of incentives out there for people who are looking to do this type of stuff. So that's kind of the quick overview. The report itself is, I think, 50 pages, and it goes through a ton of statistics and highlights different states and has various different things that you can review. I would highly encourage you guys to check it out. I had a chance to review it a little bit today, and it's pretty comprehensive. So, and they release this report every year. So it's something to just keep in mind as you guys are going down the line. So yeah, I thought I'd just open up to your guys' thoughts on not only just this article, but the affordability of housing as a whole, and ways we could potentially help, or ways that investors could potentially help people in these scenarios.
Yeah, this is a problem. It's in Canada too. I think every developed country is probably facing this at some extent, and it's sad. It's sad when you have a family or just someone individually doing everything that they can, and they're working 2 jobs, and they're probably stressed and overworked, and they still can't afford a house or accommodations. That's sad. I mean, it's a failure of the system that we let it get to that point. I don't know where the opportunities are from myself personally. Like, that's just not a space that I play in. I'd like to explore, or I hope that people would explore, perhaps taking an old office building that isn't being used and not converting it into apartments like everybody wants to do, because very few of these buildings can actually be converted anyways, to have it as be like a normal 2-bedroom apartment. But perhaps there's a way to make it that it's communal housing. So each floor, instead of them being designated into 1 or 2-bedroom apartments, they're just designated into living space where everyone has like a little section of their own and common washrooms or a common kitchen. I don't know the implications on that, or if it's feasible, but there's vacant office space all over the world right now, and there's people that don't have a place to live. It seems like somebody's got to be creative about this, and I don't know who is. I don't know who takes the lead on this. But instead of trying to go the full way of taking an office building and repurposing it completely for new 2-bedroom apartments, which everyone wants to do, try to figure out a solution where all that space can be utilized by people that don't have anywhere to live. And then you're kind of solving 2 problems at the same time of all this empty office space. But well above my pay grade, and I'm even outside of my lane, even just trying to think about it, because I just don't. I know how complex it is converting one of those in the first place, but I'm not on the engineering or the architect side or any of that. So it's a complex problem, though.
Definitely super interesting. I was actually reading about, I don't know if you saw, that California had just built, I think it was something in the vicinity of like $600 million worth of affordable housing. But the way they did it was that they built or 60 million, it was like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars had been spent on a couple of these buildings, what they were doing was that they were building brand new construction apartments, stunning, beautiful, great views, all like the whole nine, for literally homeless people. They had spent all this crazy money, and they were saying that these units in themselves were comparable to $600,000 to $700,000 units, which is just ridiculous. Which I'm in agreement with you, Chad. That, you know, doing something with the office space or anything in regards to like rooming houses, like you had mentioned, there has to be some type of solution. But what I find fascinating is that, you know, obviously our government is believing that none of this is an actual issue, and we'd rather give it to Ukraine. But that's a much different podcast episode than we're doing now. But I think that there's obviously, as someone who owns a number of apartment buildings, this is a challenge. You know, like we're really seeing that, you know, we're in this compression right now with a lot of these apartment buildings, which is the affordability index and the like this crossroad of affordability, a landlord's ability to try to make a profit, right? Because obviously, if you're in the business of real estate, you want to make money, but then you also have the ability in which, you know, you have rent control. Like Jersey, as an example, has unbelievable rent control. And it's just all these cross pathways that it's very hard now to try to see where, you know, how like, I'm trying to think of the exact, it'd be hard to say an exact era, but let's just say within the last decade, call it 2018, 2019-ish, before everything got super weird. But it's just like, you know, you run a pro forma, right, on an apartment building, you're like, oh, okay, in 3 to 5 years, I could probably be at this valuation in rent. Where nowadays, it's kind of insane because, like, you know, at certain points, like, you know, in Florida, as an example, there's a lot of rents that are coming back. They're actually dropping. It's coming down 5%. You know, we saw this earlier this year when we were reviewing some articles that some of these, you know, these areas in these mainstream areas like Austin, Texas, LA's, you know, Manhattan's, all this kind of stuff. All these places are having rent decreases because the affordability index is just so screwed at this point. I, like you guys both, have no idea what the answer is, but all I know is that we cannot clearly go down this path continuously. There's going to be an end to this of some, or, you know, or at least I feel like it has to be, because it's either that or we're just going to see millions and millions of homeless people, which I don't think. Yeah. I don't know if they're going to.
It's not a solution. Yeah, and I think, you know, I've heard Bob Knackel talk about this a lot, where it's like the way you can stem affordability or help with affordability is be able to develop. So if you allow new developers to come in and to build new product, it's a supply and demand, right? So the more supply you bring to market, then hopefully at some point you start having a decrease in the rental charge per unit. Obviously, it's a balancing act, but that's kind of the equation there. So if there's ways we can incentivize from a city's perspective or a state perspective or a federal perspective to develop more property that eventually will be circulated and put into the marketplace so that more and more people can lease, then obviously that hopefully over time will help reduce the burden of the existing inventory. So
I just don't think that we're at a level where there's too much bureaucracy in the development process, which delays how long it takes, and it's just kind of crazy. Anyways, we appreciate the input here.
Let's talk about that for a second, though, too, because on the supply side, that's one part of the equation, but the demand is the other part. And you got a government, and this is US and Canada, that is allowing so much migration in right now, either legally or illegally. There's just so many more people coming into North America that it is creating this huge imbalance. And the housing isn't able to keep up the pace that they're allowing people into the country right now. So the government is complicit with this. The government's trying to solve the homeless problem, but they're also contributing to it by having so many people coming into the country. So it like on one hand, the government's pointing fingers at one side and they're pointing fingers at the other side, and they refuse to take any accountability for this. But that's what's driving this imbalance right now, is all these new people coming in. There's nowhere for them to go. Literally, there's nowhere for them to go. So they either end up driving up prices, just supply and demand, and then it forces people who otherwise would have been able to afford it, now they can't. So
which is super
create a problem.
I love that you brought this up, because Raphael, you were saying like the number was what, 1 million homeless? What was it, 700,000?
600. I'll tell you right now. So it's I think it was 600 and change.
Let's call it 1 million, right? Because I'm sure they're
653. So it says found that approximately 653,000 people were experiencing homelessness on any given night.
Yeah, so any given night, right? So there's quite a, they call it 1 million or more, right? Like, because they're probably undercounting. But the reason why, what I think is so fascinating, I'm glad you brought this up, because it's like we've let over 10 million people into the country in the last 4 years or something ridiculous. So it's just like, and we've given a very large percentage of those individuals housing. And it's like, I think we would have, if we had never done that, we would have been in a much different place. And I'm not saying don't have people come into the country legally, but, it's like all of a sudden when you have to house millions upon millions of people in a very short window of time, I do believe you're obviously going to put yourself in a position where it causes these types of issues. But, and Nick also commented. No, agreed.
Yeah. There's just no money, exactly. And there's a few people who have commented, so we'll throw some up there. So Nick is a buddy of mine. He's actually local. He's a lender here locally, commercial lender. So a real issue I see is that there isn't many construction companies willing to build a house that costs less than $325,000. The land is too expensive, and it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense for them to build 500,000 plus homes, and the inventory isn't beneficial for first-time home buyer, so that the borrowing base is nearly eliminated from buying a home. The product just isn't there yet. Tons of demand for this product, but no one is willing to do it feasibly. So I agree.
Yeah, like unless does Elon Musk own that company Boxable or whatever the heck it's called with those little small houses? Does he own? I don't know.
No, but he likes the company.
He likes yeah. But I'm just saying, like, you'd think that they'd figure out a way to maybe do through whatever which way that we could decide to get some of the land. But like there's some land in Florida right now that you could buy 2,000, hundreds of acres, dozens of acres, thousands of acres for a fairly affordable price, and you could throw up 75,000 boxable homes or something like that for a much more affordable price, $50,000 a house, and try to rent them out for $500 a piece. I mean, like, it doesn't have to be I don't understand why people haven't done this. Like, should I waste $10 million and do this right now and just solve a huge affordability problem? It's just like, why is that so complicated?
I mean, Boxable can't keep up with demand. So I think they were trying at one point, I think we read an article where they were trying to establish like a 1 million square foot production year. That so I'm sure there's companies out there that are looking to try to help with this problem, but it just hasn't gotten to the point yet where it's going to solve itself overnight. So Trilla DC said,
as long as Gavin Newsom is not involved in the decision making, I think we'll be okay.
We're going down a rabbit hole today, aren't we? Just kidding.
That's right. I'm okay with it.
All right, let's see what we got here. Next up is Chad's article. I'm excited to learn a little bit more about this one. So I believe it is, next up is Chad's article. So robo forklifts rev up Walmart's warehouses.
Yeah, this is a bit of an older article. I think this is one that I put on for a show that maybe we just weren't able to do at the time. But this is fascinating, and it goes to show, well, there's a couple of storylines on this. The first is that driverless vehicles or autonomous vehicles is continuing to grow, and that's not slowing down. What I find really interesting about this one is Walmart is, I can't remember how many they got, but they're retrofitting a few large warehouses with these driverless forklifts. And I think it's actually a great spot to get a bunch of data, because the challenge with autonomous vehicles in an open setting is there's so many variables you can't predict. So a kid running across the street chasing a ball, or a pylon that got put up and was closing a road, but the car can't detect it. They're trying to solve all these problems, but it's still very difficult. In a warehouse, you have a closed system. You don't have those same challenges of weather elements or things just popping up that you can't control. So I think this will become very prominent in warehouses in the near future, is to have autonomous vehicles that a lot of the work is routine and it's consistent and you do the same thing over and over again. They'll be able to perfect this system And I would expect that we'll see many more companies adopting these driverless forklift systems.
Yeah,
I think
Go ahead.
I do think that within the next probably decade or two, I don't even know why you'd have any human beings in a factory anymore. Just for efficiency's sake, other than management or people who can repair the robots. I'm in complete agreement. I actually think this will. The thing that everyone's going to argue on this is that it's replacing jobs. And we just talked about affordability issues, which with companies or whatever, or with individuals who are not able to make X amount of money. However, I do believe it just changes the dynamic, because now it's like, because this is, I obviously, you take this for what it is. This is just my 2 cents. I feel like the jobs aren't lost; they're just moved, right? Like, because now the company that's manufacturing, is going to need different jobs replaced. Like people who can repair them. Like, you're not going to have robots repairing robots right now. Like, it's probably not going to be occurring, right? So the jobs just get moved to a different type of work overall, which obviously you just might need a different level of education or understanding. I don't really think that it's really, I think there's only positives here. I'm a huge fan of robotics. I think we should be continuing to do so. And I think it only creates more efficiencies, because the more efficient that these companies can become, like Walmart, they can lower their prices, which they're trying to do. Walmart's trying to keep their prices low to keep it easier for.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I would say, it's definitely a unique position. But I think there's more to the story. I think just blanket replacing jobs overnight for people who have been operating in that space for decades is very difficult. I know there was, I don't know if you remember back in the day where they were talking about, there was this, they were making, I had a lot of friends who were entrepreneurs that were in the software space that always kind of make fun of this, is that they were talking about converting like coal miners into software developers. And so there was this big push to try to get people who were in these industries that have now become kind of archaic and are starting to go the way of the dinosaur, to try to get them onboarded into a more modern industry. But if you've been in this vertical for 20 plus years and you really haven't refined a skill set to then now go apply into a new business, it's a lot harder to really manage that. So I think it wouldn't be wise to just blanket assume that these people can convert from what they're doing currently into a new role. And so I think we just got to be cognizant of the fact that it needs to be a kind of gradual transition. One of the big industries that have been targeted by automation is the trucking industry, which is, I think, the number one profession for people who don't have a college degree. I think it's the number one job. So imagine eliminating, I think it's like 4 to 5 million people have a trucking job. So imagine eliminating that overnight without any type of transition period. I think it'd be very detrimental to a lot of households. So granted, I do think there's going to be a lot of efficiencies that we save on being able to pursue that route. And I think in the long run, it's the right thing to do. But being able to do that in a way that's more responsible is going to be important. So that's just my thoughts.
What's interesting also is that, you see a lot of these different robotic implementations all over the place. I mean, we did an article about a fast food company that has absolutely 0 employees and was 100% robotic. If you go to the lounges at United in New Jersey, you see that there's actually literally a robot that goes around and collects, garbage. Right. And you can put your plates down. So it's removing another job. It's just interesting. I think that I think that this is slowly becoming if you're aware, right, if you're a part of the aware group of individuals, right, not the people who just kind of fly through life, but the people who are aware, and you can be paying attention to where things are going. I think if you can realize this is the time where you and your family and your kids and the kids to come possibly should be focusing on where the puck is going with jobs, right? Being in sales and sales opportunities where, we're creating your own jobs, right? And being an entrepreneur and going to start your own business versus trying to, it's not like factory workers was the end all goal. No one goes to college and I can't wait to be a factory worker, or I can't wait to work in fast food, or I can't wait to, be a truck driver. These people aren't saying that. They just end up in these jobs. And I think the people who are really paying attention, the people who are awake, paying attention, they should be, up leveling their abilities, their mental ability, and going out instead of going to be the truck driver, go buy 3 robotic trucks and start up your own routes, right? Why? It's just, utilize what's in front of you versus saying looking at only the poor, the negative implications.
No, I agree. I mean, that's a very positive way to look at it. Now, do I think that the average person has that type of mindset?
They're not.
They don't.
They're definitely not.
Exactly. Exactly.
They're not.
When you extrapolate it over a huge population like we have here in this country. So I'm of that same mindset. I think it's important for anyone, regardless of what profession you're in, you never rest on your laurels, because there's no such thing as job security anymore. And really there shouldn't be. I think it's all merit based. I believe in a true meritocracy. So if you are performing at a high level, you should be overcompensated or compensated based on the performance that you actually have. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at a holistic view of the world or this particular problem, you have to understand and put into consideration that not everyone is going to be able to make that jump. And when you're talking about millions of people, even if a fraction of those people can't make the jump, you're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that could be impacted. So from a societal standpoint, we just got to be cognizant of that. But
for sure.
This kind of reminds me of like this. We're on the cusp of a revolution that will be predominantly automated and AI driven. And I think that this will be as transformational as the Industrial Revolution was in the late 1700s. And there was a similar conversation that happened at that time when they started getting mechanical machines that were capable of doing the work of several semi-skilled people, and they revolted against that technology too. That's where the term Luddites comes from. Is Ned Luddite was the head of this. I don't know if they actually even figured out who Ned was, but that movement was the Luddite movement, where they wanted to destroy, and they actually did destroy in a number of cases, this machinery that replaced several workers. And I think we're going to see that same pushback where AI or automation can and will take jobs. I don't know if you can slow it down. As good as it would be to say, well, we need to keep everybody protected and we don't want to have 5 million people out of work, I don't know if you can slow that down. Like it's such a powerful machine, figuratively and literally, that's moving, that to try and slow it down or reverse it, I think it's too late. I think it's coming much faster than any of us want to admit. And
I agree.
For those who are proactive and adjust, I think that there's still going to be plenty of work. It's just going to be in a different area. And those that don't are going to be the ones that are sacrificed. And it's like homelessness. It's a very complex problem that doesn't have an easy solution.
I love the conversation. We're getting pretty
I heard the government's hiring.
Yeah. Is that it? All right. So next up, Federal Reserve hints on considering rate cut. Group predicts slowing job growth. Office attendance drops. So I wanted to bring this up just because I wanted to get at least your opinion, and I want to get the opinion of the people watching this content. The reason why I wanted this article, Powell originally said that I think there was going to be 6 rate cuts this year, right? I think that was the very first thing we had heard. I think it was something like 6, if I remember correctly. Please don't quote me if I'm wrong. I understand. I think it was something around 6. Now, obviously, he's done 0 year to date, and I think they were even saying that they're probably going to maybe do 1, if that. Okay. Now, this article goes on to say they are. Let me read this exactly. So I got to open it up in full screen. So give me 1 second here. But yeah, Powell says labor market is not the source of broad inflationary pressures from the economy now, with conditions resembling those presented at the pandemic through the. Sorry, I'm just trying to find where it says here. So, okay, reducing policy restraint too late and too little could unduly weaken economic activity and unemployment. Basically, through reading this article, which I thought was very interesting, because if you look down towards where here, which says at the very bottom. The June inflation numbers, you can just leave it where it is, right? June inflation numbers are scheduled to be released later this week. The Labor Department's latest consumer price index showed May's annual inflation rate of 3.3%, well below the peak of obviously 9.1 in the mid-2022s. A similar consumer expenditure gauge for the Commerce Department preferred by the Fed showed May's annual inflation at 2.6%, close to the Fed's previously targeted 2%. So we're kind of getting to the point where I'm curious, gentlemen, do you think we're going to get a rate cut this year, or do you think we're going to be in 2025? Do you even think there'll be a rate cut in 2025? When do you believe the first rate cut will occur? Because I'm very curious.
I think if the feds are being honest with themselves and honest with us, inflation is nowhere near under control. And you can look at it just from housing. Housing costs are which we talked about earlier. So how can the feds honestly say that inflation is at their 2% target when everything that we need to live, housing, transportation, food, all the things that are actually components of our lives, not a CPI metric, but like our day-to-day what we spend, I know I'm spending a lot more every single month than I was 2 years ago. So inflation is not under control. And if they are true to what they say, that this arbitrary 2% inflation target that they literally picked out of the air, there's no academic research whatsoever on why 2% needs to be there. If they say that they want to get to this 2% target rate and they're true about it, there's no way they can cut rates right now. However, I think that there's going to be so much political pressure coming up with the election in November. Just affordability in general, inflation, interest rates are a factor in that. It's interesting that they're using interest rates as a lever to try and lower inflation, but interest rates by themselves are inflationary. You have a mortgage, if you're on or have any floating debt, any variable debt, those costs have now gone up because of interest rates. So I think the whole system is completely messed up. It's all subsidy driven. It's all propped up on phony money that is printed for reasons we can't even comprehend or understand. And our entire system does not follow any economic projection or theory out there, because it's never in the history of mankind has this situation that we're dealing with ever been replicated. So I have no idea. I think political pressure will probably be the major driver, but inflation in my mind is still very problematic. And I think for that reason alone, they shouldn't, if that's what their goal is. But why is it 2%? That doesn't make any sense to me either. So I think this whole system is it's primed for something crazy to happen. But it's almost like you put all these things into a bucket. You mix all these random things together, chemicals or whatever it is, and just mix it into this jar, and you shake that jar really hard, and then you open the jar and see what it comes out. You have no idea, because you have no idea what's even in there, what you're gonna make. I think that's what we have right now. We have all these things that just make no sense whatsoever, that are all getting put into a jar, and we're just gonna see what comes out when someone takes the lid off.
Yeah. I want to add just real quick before I let you go, Raphael, which is it is wild that this 2% BS, right? The 2.6 now, or 3.3 or whatever it was recently. What's interesting though is that it's going off of a 12-month period. But obviously what we're all feeling as everyday average people, right? What we're feeling is we're feeling the adjustment from 2020, right? The 2018, 2019, 2021, before because there's I think they said that it was over 20% inflation. Everything is at least 20% more expensive than it was just 4 years ago, right? Instead of the traditional 2%, 3% per year, right? Which is typical, right? We're up 20% in 4 years. Which is, obviously incredibly substantial. I think it might even be more now. That's why the 2% is annual, where, which honestly is, like you said, is a BS thing. But we're feeling the more drastic shifts from 3-4 years ago. But I'll let you continue, Raphael.
Yeah, no, I'm on Chad's boat. I don't think they should lower interest rates at all this year, and really probably even pushing into 2025 in order to really make sure that we can quell inflation. Because even the metrics that are reporting, I mean, you can manipulate the inflation numbers all you want. I mean, it depends on the basket of goods and services that you track, and they always talk about the weighting, exactly, and there's a weighting factor involved as well. So literally, you can manipulate the data to kind of reflect whatever you want. And obviously, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, a lot of this is, as much as they're supposed to be an independent agency, which I think, again, that for the most part they are, but there's obviously external pressure from a variety of different factors that play into the decision-making process for these different individuals. And so, to Chad's point, if I were in Jerome Powell's shoes, I would not lower rates at all this year. And really, I wouldn't even consider it until early to mid next year. And depending on how the environment is at that time, then maybe even keeping it steady for the remainder of 25, which it hurts for me to say as someone who is a broker that loves to, I mean, obviously I represent investors and they're hoping to have relief on interest rates. But, if it were me, I wouldn't do it. So
this is another example too of how dumb the government is. So the government, and this even goes back to your comment earlier, Henry, about the Ukraine, the government is spending money they don't have. And they did that all through the pandemic, spending money on all these programs and incentives, spending all this money that they don't have, printing all this money, adding to the money supply. And then what happens is they're printing all this money. Well, of course, inflation is going to go up. If you add all this new money to the system, it's going to go up. And this is just the government being as stupid as they are. now that you have higher interest rates, their debt servicing costs on all their debt is that much higher now. And I can't remember what it was exactly, but the debt service cost just for federal debt is exceeding any other department right now in the US. Military spending, Medicare, it's the highest single expense item on the government's books right now is debt service. And they did this themselves. Like, it's crazy that there's no leadership or actually nobody smart in the government that's not saying, okay, well, wait, we're going to print all this money because we don't have any. We're going to send all this money to Ukraine that we don't have. It's not even money that we have. We have to make this money. We're going to spend all this on government programs and subsidies and everything else. And that's going to raise the cost that when we actually have to start paying for all this debt, now we're not going to be able to afford it. So it's like the government is probably the biggest screw up, and they're probably the ones that are most screwed in this system because now they have all this debt that they have to pay back. And like if we looked at ourselves individually, if we would have went over the last 10 years, let's call it, and someone gave us a credit card with 0% interest, and they're like, have at her. Well, we'd probably buy everything we possibly could, right? We'd probably max out that credit card because it's 0% interest. That's what the government did. They bought everything that they wanted. They bought everything that they couldn't afford. And now the interest rates have gone from 0 to 5%. And they're screwed. Like, it's a massive problem. And I don't know how they dig themselves out of this. It was a series of bad mistakes made by stupid people. And it seems like the same stupid people are running the ship. So I had no idea. Like I said, this is like an experiment where a case studies decades and centuries from now, they'll look back on it and say, that was a crazy time. I think we're living in that right now.
Like they just keep raising the debt. I was going to say, and they keep raising the debt ceiling, right? It's not like there's no end. I'm saying there is no end. It's not like they don't have a ceiling. It's a BS shadow ceiling, right? Like, there's a ceiling. And then they vote on it, and it's raised.
Until people stop buying government debt, and then we get into a hyperinflation scenario, which I don't think we're going to come to, hopefully, in our lifetime. But again, at some point, there's going to be a standoff where it's like, okay, well, no one is going to buy American securities. We've already gotten downgraded from what we used to have as far as our credit rating is concerned. So, it's an untenable situation. And I think at the end of the day, the only solution is to, number one, keep biting the bullet and not raise rates. And then kind of wishful thinking is to cut. We got to cut spending in a variety of different categories, which I don't think is ever going to happen because it's a lot easier to add a line item on the expenditure sheet from a government standpoint. It's a lot harder to cut because there's a lot of special interests involved and people want to keep budgets, for different things that they're associated with. And so, do I think we're going to have budget cuts? No, unless it's like absolutely necessary. You see it in Argentina where they had this massive cutting of all these different programs and people are going through a lot of pain right now, but it just had to be done because they were in a period that, their hyperinflation at one time, I think they had like 1,000% year over year increase in inflation. Like, could you imagine how crippling that is to an economy? So hopefully it doesn't get to that point.
Well, that's the only thing that's keeping the American and Canadian economies from outright collapsing is that every other government in the world is just as stupid. Every other government is spending with reckless abandon. They're all printing money, every government. So it's one of those things that if you're like, you and your closest 19 friends, if the 20 of you are all getting fat at the same time, you probably don't all notice. But if there was one guy that was getting really fat and the other 19 were still skinny, that one fat guy would stand out. We're all getting fat. It's just all across you put all the countries together, we're all just getting fat. It remains to be seen, does somebody break away from that? Does some leadership group actually come in and say, let's fix our economy. Let's balance a budget. As crazy as that sounds, let's actually run a balanced budget, position ourselves to compete for the long term as opposed to just trying to satisfy the special interests and the needs of right now. That's what every government's doing. Every government's trying to solve problems right now. And it doesn't seem like there's many countries that are thinking long term.
I mean, it's really just kind of a free for all right now, and everyone's trying to get their hand on as much money as they possibly can because they know we're screwed. It's like all these special interest groups are just like, 20 years from now, we're going to be screwed. But if we can make as much money as we humanly can right now, we'll be okay. We'll be able to weather the storm. We'll be like Nancy Pelosi, making 200 grand on the books and actually worth $400 million out of nowhere. They're going to have no idea. So,
all right. So next up is an article I have just kind of illustrating the impact of interest rates and how they've affected properties. In particular, as we're seeing more and more distressed properties come available. So from distressed properties see a 43% average valuation drop from issuance. The average results were 140 basis points worse than at the end of 2023. So this article just kind of highlights what we're seeing is when properties are essentially becoming distress. Now, the level of distress is still not quite what we probably expect that to be. There was a slight tick up in total distress and properties coming to auction, but not nearly as much as a lot of people were professing it to be. But of those properties that do qualify as distressed, we're seeing a pretty stark decrease in their actual original value versus what they're currently trading at. So by property value, you can see here, if it's more than $100 million, you're seeing about a 37% drop off from its original basis. If it's a $50 million property to a $100 million property, roughly 44%. A $25 million to $50 million property, 32%. 10 to 25 million at 38%. And then 5 to 10, which, that's where a lot of, private clients operate, which I'm sure a lot of us work with. It's 47% drop off, which is pretty sizable. And then less than 5 million is roughly 51% drop off from their heights. And so, obviously, each valuation is a case-by-case basis. There may be situations where, there's been a significant vacancy in the property. Maybe there hasn't been significant vacancy in the property, but they just haven't been able to execute their business plan as efficiently as they probably thought they could. And thus it became in distressed territory and the bank repossessed it. A lot of people had fixed interest rate periods for a while that all of a sudden spiked. And even though maybe they have a property that has decent occupancy, they were just not able to service the debt properly and they've had to get repossessed. So, there's a variety of different scenarios as to why, they may be in these distress situations. But again, it just provides a little bit color of what currently is going on in the distress markets and how it's affecting people who ultimately have lost these properties. So thought I'd kind of throw it out to you guys. I don't know if you guys have seen a lot of distress, at least in my market. We really haven't seen a whole lot yet, but who knows? I mean, there have been a couple buildings downtown, office buildings in downtown Louisville that have, had to be repossessed. There's actually 2 that I know of right now. One was roughly about $8 million acquisition. I think it's going to trade probably at $2 to $3 million. And then another one just filed for bankruptcy, and I think it was a $28 million building, which would probably trade at like 7 or 8 million, which is crazy. It just is what it is.
I do believe also there's a huge element of this because obviously this is good eye candy for our news articles, but evaluations and appraisal values is one thing, which I think all three of us will agree, and many brokers will agree. Property values are clearly ticking downwards, right, based on interest rates. However, it doesn't mean there's a lot of sales, right? It's not like these people, not like infinite amount of these people need to sell today. So which is why, I don't think there's a quote bloodbath in the sales world. We're not seeing it like 08, 09, 2010, where people were had to sell because they had no money and they had to let the properties go. So we don't see that specifically. I mean, obviously there's a piece of the market that is being drastically affected. They actually can't afford it. Exactly like you just said, office markets and a few other of the syndicators who bought properties 2 or 3 years ago had this big, beautiful pro forma saying we're going to have absolutely no problem in achieving these numbers. These are conservative. We'll be just fine. And all of a sudden they get smacked with 7.5% interest rates, and they're obviously not able to refinance like they thought they could. I do believe that there's a lot of this going on. And for those brokers out there who are excited, like I am, about the opportunities to come, I just think it's about hitting the phones harder, finding these people who actually need to sell, who are actually experiencing these challenges, and hopefully, you can get your piece of it.
I couldn't agree more with what you said there, Henry. That's exactly what I was thinking too. Downtown office buildings are struggling, and understandably so. They're just operating at far less vacancy than they have historically. And the syndicators. And that could also be just even individual investors that overstretched themselves in 2020, 21, and thought that everything was going to be rosy for the foreseeable future. I think for the most part, we're not seeing much distress outside of office right now either, because it's a cash flow problem more than an equity problem. equity has gone down, but that's on paper. If you're not using that for anything else, you're more concerned about cash flow right now. And if you're occupied, why would you sell into a down market? We're in a down market. There's pressure on prices across the board. Even institutional grade brand new properties have had to decline in value on paper. But if they still have their tenants in there and they're still collecting rent, hold on to that thing. And I think that's the mentality that most people are taking, is why sell into a down market if you have cash flow? Your cash flow is probably down, especially if you've had to renew a mortgage right now. But banks also don't want to be taking back all these properties just because of fear of cash flow erosion. Banks are working with people right now to make sure that they don't have to take back a flood of properties. I don't think that there's going to be a bloodbath outside of the office market. I think downtown office market is still in early chapters. I think I think that gets worse personally, but I don't see an owner who's got equity in there. Maybe the equity's gone down now because of the value, but they still have equity. They still have cash flowing tenants. I don't see panic with any of those guys right now. If the economy changes and they start getting more vacancy or there's downward pressure on their rental rates, that's another story. And then at that point, we'd have to reevaluate whether there's a bloodbath. But with things staying as they are right now, I just don't see a ton of properties coming on the market in that fire sale mode.
No, I'm in the same boat as you. I mean, I haven't seen it in my local market. I just was curious as to hear you all and if you've seen anything in your guys again.